The slap echoed through Harbor Grill like a gunshot, silencing 70 years of quiet dignity in a single brutal second. Elias Brooks, Purple Heart recipient, Korean War survivor, a man who'd bled for this country before most of Ridgehaven was even born, stood with blood trickling from his cheekbone, scattered quarters glinting on the linoleum like fallen stars. Trent Calloway's ring had opened skin, but it was his words that cut deeper. "Apologize for breathing my air, old man." The diner held its breath. Then Elias reached for his phone with the steady hand of someone who'd faced far worse than small-town hatred, and made one call that would shatter everything. If you're watching from your city, drop a comment below and let me know where this story reaches. Hit that like button and stay until the end, because what happens next will restore your faith that justice, however delayed, still has teeth. The morning of March 14th arrived in Ridgehaven the way it always did, with mist rolling off Lake Donovan, coating Main Street in a gray veil that wouldn't lift until noon. The town of 4,200 souls tucked into the Appalachian foothills of Western Virginia had perfected the art of looking picturesque while harboring the kind of quiet rot that only outsiders could smell. Harbor Grill occupied the corner of Main and Birch, a converted railroad depot with red vinyl booths and a counter that had served the same families for 3 generations. The breakfast crowd shuffled in around 6:30. Contractors with calloused hands, retirees reading yesterday's news, the occasional trucker breaking up I-81's monotony with eggs and bacon. Elias Brooks had been part of that rhythm for nearly a decade, ever since his wife Margaret passed, and the silence of their small house on Oakwood Drive became too heavy to bear alone. He'd arrive at 7 sharp, take the corner booth by the window, and order the same thing: black coffee, wheat toast, 2 scrambled eggs. He'd eat slowly, sometimes reading a paperback western, sometimes just watching the town wake up with eyes that had seen too much world to be impressed by Ridgehaven's small dramas. At 72, Elias carried himself with the kind of posture that didn't advertise but couldn't hide. Shoulders that had once hauled ammunition crates through Korean mountain passes, a spine that stayed straight even when arthritis whispered otherwise. His cardigan was faded navy, soft from 1,000 washes. His hands bore scars that no one in Harbor Grill had ever asked about, and a wedding band he still turned absently whenever he thought about Margaret. The Purple Heart stayed in his wallet, tucked behind his driver's license. He'd learned long ago that some people treated medals like permission to ask invasive questions, while others resented them entirely. Easier to keep it hidden, let people see just an old black man nursing coffee and counting quarters. Lena Cruz had been working the morning shift at Harbor Grill for 6 years, ever since her husband's construction accident left her the sole provider for 2 kids under 10. She'd learned to read the room like a survival skill: who tipped, who complained, who needed the check before their parking meter expired. But she'd also learned to read people, and Elias Brooks was one of the good ones. "Morning, Mr. Brooks," she said, setting his coffee down without being asked. "Fresh pot." "Morning, Lena. How's Miguel's science project coming?" Her face brightened the way it always did when someone remembered her kids' names. "Finished it last night, volcano. Made a mess of my kitchen, but he's so proud." Margaret used to say the best learning comes with a little chaos. Elias's smile held the weight of decades. "Tell him I expect a full report next time." "Will do." Lena squeezed his shoulder briefly, a gesture of warmth in a place that often ran cold, then moved to refill mugs down the counter. Across the diner, Trent Calloway tracked the interaction with the focus of a man who cataloged grievances. At 46, Trent had inherited his father's auto repair shop, his grandfather's house, and a poisonous certainty that Ridgehaven belonged to people who looked like him, which meant it didn't belong to people who didn't. He sat with his usual crew in the center booth: Kyle Drucker, whose family owned the hardware store; Pastor Jim Havens from Ridgehaven Community Church, who preached love on Sundays and practiced something else the rest of the week; and Tom Bannister, a county commissioner whose campaign signs still littered front yards 6 months after the election. "Look at her fawning all over him," Trent muttered, loud enough to carry. "Man can't even afford a decent tip, but she acts like he's special." Kyle snorted into his hash browns. "Maybe she likes charity cases." "Charity's one thing. This is something else." Trent's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. "You notice he's here every damn day? taking up space, acting like he owns the place. Pastor Jim's voice carried that particular sanctimony that made even agreement sound like scripture. Everyone's welcome in Ridgehaven, Trent. We just ask they respect our values. Respect. Trent's laugh had edges. Hard to respect people who don't belong but won't take the hint. Tom Bannister, who'd built a career on knowing which fights to avoid, shifted uncomfortably. Let's not make a scene, gentlemen. Bad for business. But Trent was already moving, standing with the deliberate slowness of someone who wanted an audience. The diner's ambient noise, silverware on plates, the hiss of the grill, fragments of conversation, dropped half a decibel as people registered the shift in atmosphere. Outside, Noah Reed was adjusting his camera angle to capture Harbor Grill's vintage signage when movement inside caught his attention. At 23, Noah was halfway through a documentary film degree at Virginia Commonwealth University, and he'd pitched Small Town Americana as his senior thesis, a nostalgic look at places time forgot, narrated with warm voiceover and artful shots of weathered buildings. What he was about to capture would change everything. He pressed record, intending to grab 10 seconds of diner ambiance through the window, when he saw a large white man in a Carhartt jacket walk deliberately toward an elderly black man sitting alone in the corner. Inside, Elias looked up from his coffee as Trent Calloway's shadow fell across the table. "Help you with something?" Elias's voice was measured, polite, the tone of someone who'd navigated hostile spaces his whole life and knew that calm was a weapon. "Yeah, actually." Trent planted his hands on the table, leaning in. "Been wondering something. You here every single day, same time, same seat. Don't you have somewhere else to be?" The diner went silent. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the sizzle from the grill seemed to quiet. Elias met Trent's eyes without flinching. "I'm a paying customer, same as anyone." "Paying customer." Trent repeated it like the words tasted wrong. "With what? Pocket change? Saw you counting quarters last week like a damn homeless person." "My money's legal tender, last I checked." Elias's hand remained steady on his coffee cup, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, of a type he'd encountered before. "Is there a minimum now?" Lena appeared at Trent's elbow, her voice professional, but tight. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to return to your seat. Mr. Brooks hasn't done anything wrong." "Wasn't talking to you, Lena." Trent didn't even glance at her. "And I'm not saying he did anything wrong, just asking if maybe he'd be more comfortable elsewhere." "Elsewhere." Elias set his cup down carefully, precisely, the way bomb disposal experts handled live ordnance. "You mean somewhere that doesn't offend your sensibilities?" "I mean somewhere that fits." Trent's voice rose, playing to the room now. "This is a family establishment. We got standards. We got a certain atmosphere." Kyle Drucker added from the booth, "Nothing personal, old man. Just how things are." Pastor Jim's contribution dripped with false compassion. "Perhaps if you tried the Waffle House over in Smithton, I live here." Elias's words cut through the noise like a blade through fog. "I've lived in Ridgehaven for 12 years. I pay taxes. I vote. I eat breakfast where I choose. And I'm not moving." The defiance, quiet, dignified, absolute, ignited something ugly in Trent's face. "You're not moving," he repeated, voice dropping to something more dangerous than shouting. "You think you can just, what? Decide how things work in our town? It's my town too." Elias stood slowly, gathering his jacket, clearly intending to leave before this escalated further. "Now, if you'll excuse me," Trent shifted, blocking the aisle. 6 feet of working man muscle and entitlement, creating a wall between Elias and the door. "Didn't say you could go yet." Outside, Noah's camera captured everything through the window. The confrontation, the blocked exit, the way every other person in the diner suddenly found their plates fascinating. His hands shook slightly, instinct warring with documentation. He kept filming. Inside, Lena's voice sharpened. "Trent, that's enough. I'm calling the manager." "Sam?" Trent laughed. "Sam's my cousin. But go ahead." Elias tried to step around him, movements careful, non-threatening. "I don't want trouble." "Should have thought of that before you came here." Trent shoved him, not hard enough to knock him down, but forceful enough to send him stumbling backward into the table. Elias's hand caught the edge, upsetting his water glass. It shattered on the floor, along with the neat stack of quarters he'd left for Lena's tip, coins scattering, rolling, some disappearing under the booth like fleeing witnesses. The sound of breaking glass punctuated what everyone would later claim to have not quite seen. "Oops," Trent said, voice thick with mock concern. "Clumsy. Maybe you should be more careful." Elias straightened slowly, cardigan sleeve darkening where water had splashed. His face remained composed, but his breathing changed. Deeper, more controlled, the way soldiers breathe when adrenaline hits and training takes over. "I'll pay for the glass," he said quietly. "Damn right you will." Trent advanced another step. "Along with an apology for making everyone uncomfortable." An apology. Elias's voice held something new now. Not fear, but something colder. Recognition that this moment had been inevitable since the first day he'd walked into Harbor Grill and dared to exist where he wasn't wanted. For what, exactly? For breathing my air, Trent's hand shot out, gripping Elias's shoulder. For taking up space, for acting like you belong when everyone here knows. What happened next occurred in the span of a heartbeat, but would be dissected in courtrooms, newsrooms, and comment sections for months afterward. Elias's hand moved to his phone. Not aggressively, not threatening, just a simple reach into his jacket pocket. Trent, reading it as resistance or defiance or simply needing an excuse, pulled back his right hand, the one with the class ring from Ridgehaven High, gold with a fake ruby, worn every day for 28 years, and swung. The slap connected with Elias's left cheekbone with a crack that stopped hearts. The ring's edge opened skin in a clean line from eye to jaw, blood welling immediately, dark against brown skin gone suddenly ashen. Elias staggered, caught himself against the table. Quarters danced across linoleum like scattered stars. The diner held its collective breath. Then Elias straightened. Not quickly. Each movement deliberate, measured, the way a man rises when he knows falling would mean more than physical defeat. His hand found his phone, still in his pocket. The other hand pressed his napkin to his bleeding face. When he looked at Trent Calloway, his eyes held 72 years of every indignity he'd swallowed, every slur he'd ignored, every moment he'd made himself small to survive spaces that wanted him gone. "You just made," Elias said softly, "a serious mistake." "Yeah?" Trent's bravado cracked slightly at the edges, but he doubled down. "What are you going to do, old man? Call the cops? Half of them eat here. Know who they'll believe?" Elias pulled out his phone. His hand shook, not with fear, but with the effort of remaining controlled when every instinct screamed to act. Blood dripped onto his cardigan. No one moved to help him, except Lena, who'd already pulled out her own phone, camera recording, hands shaking with fury. "I saw everything," she said, voice carrying. "Every word, every shove." Kyle stood from the booth. "Lena, don't be stupid. Sit down, Kyle." Her phone stayed up. "All of you, sit down." Outside, Noah had pressed himself against the window, camera capturing angles through the glass. The blood, the scattered money, the crowd of people who'd become accomplices through inaction. Elias's fingers found a number in his contacts. Not 911, not the local police. Something else. He pressed speaker because he wanted them all to hear this. The phone rang once, twice. Then a voice answered, controlled, professional, carrying the unmistakable authority of someone used to being obeyed instantly. "Dad, where are you?" The single word, "Dad," landed in the diner like a bomb. Elias's voice stayed steady despite the blood now soaking his collar. "Harbor Grill, Main and Birch, Ridgehaven. There's been an incident." "Are you hurt?" The voice on the other end shifted, concern bleeding through professionalism. "Some. I'll survive. But Malcolm," Elias's eyes locked on Trent Calloway's face, watching comprehension dawn like sickness. "I need you to know the name of the man who just assaulted me is Trent Calloway, and there are witnesses." Silence on the phone. Not empty silence, but the kind that precedes hurricanes. "Spell the last name." Elias did, each letter enunciated clearly. "I'm sending agents. Don't move. Don't engage. Are you in immediate danger?" "No." Elias kept his eyes on Trent, whose face had drained of color. "Not anymore." "Stay on the line." Around the diner, people began to understand that whatever they'd thought this was, a local dispute, an old man getting what certain people believed he deserved, something that would disappear like morning mist, had just become something else entirely. Pastor Jim's voice came out strangled. Malcolm? As in, Malcolm Brooks? Elias didn't answer him. He spoke into the phone instead. The man who assaulted me is still here. So are approximately 15 witnesses, most of whom did nothing. I'm accessing the situation now. Malcolm's voice had gone cold, clinical. Dad, I'm looking at your phone's location. There's a security camera at the intersection. I'm pulling traffic cam footage. And I'm sending a team from the Richmond field office. ETA 23 minutes. Trent found his voice, but it came out wrong, too high, too desperate. Now hold on, this was a misunderstanding. Don't speak to him. Malcolm's voice crackled through the speaker, sharp enough to cut. If you're the individual who assaulted my father, do not approach him. Do not leave the premises. Federal agents are en route. The word federal rippled through Harbor Grill like electricity through water. Federal, Tom Bannister whispered. Jesus Christ. Kyle grabbed Trent's arm. What did you do? Who's his kid? Trent's mouth worked soundlessly, but Elias answered for him, voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly suffocating diner. My son, he said clearly, is Director Malcolm Brooks. He runs the Department of Homeland Security's Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Division. He investigates hate crimes, federal hate crimes. The air went out of the room. Trent stumbled backward like he'd been shoved. You didn't know, Elias repeated, that I was a person who mattered. That I was someone's father, someone's husband, until cancer took her. Someone who served this country in Korea when you weren't even a thought in your daddy's head. He pressed the napkin harder against his bleeding face. You didn't know because you didn't ask. Because to you, I was just something in your way. Lena's recording was still running. Noah's camera outside was still running. And somewhere in the ether, digital evidence was already being compiled. Traffic cameras, security footage, phone records, all of it flowing toward people who knew exactly how to build cases that didn't fall apart. Malcolm's voice came through again. Dad, I have Agent Sanchez on another line. She's coordinating with local PD. They're being informed that this is now a federal matter, and they are not to interfere with the scene or the witnesses. Understood, Elias said. From the kitchen, Harbor Grill's owner, Sam Pritchard, Trent's cousin, a man who'd served Elias breakfast for a decade without ever asking his name, emerged with a towel. He approached slowly, hands visible, and offered it to Elias without speaking. Elias took it, replaced the blood-soaked napkin. Thank you. Sam nodded once, then retreated. Small gesture, insufficient, but something. Trent was still talking, words spilling out in panic torrents. This is insane. I barely touched him. It was an accident. The ring caught wrong. He's exaggerating. The security footage, Malcolm interrupted calmly, will show exactly what happened, as will the recording that woman is holding, as will the camera of whoever's filming from outside. Pause. Yes, I can see him through the traffic cam. Tell him thank you for the documentation. Noah, hearing this somehow, felt his knees weaken. His camera didn't waver. Inside, Pastor Jim stood, attempting authority that had already evaporated. Now listen, I'm sure we can work this out like Christians. Were you planning to work it out? Elias asked quietly, before you knew who my son was. Jim's mouth closed. Gee, because from where I'm standing, covered in my own blood, surrounded by people who watched a man assault me and did nothing, I'm wondering where your Christianity was 5 minutes ago. No one answered. The distant sound of sirens began to filter through the morning air, not the casual wail of a single local squad car, but multiple vehicles converging fast. Trent tried one more time. Look, I'm sorry, okay? It got out of hand. I didn't mean... Stop talking, Tom Bannister hissed. For God's sake, Trent, shut up. Kyle had gone pale. They're really coming. Feds? Through the window, Noah watched as 2 black SUVs pulled up to the curb with the kind of precision that suggested this wasn't their first coordinated arrival. 4 agents emerged, 2 men, 2 women, all in dark suits, all moving with the fluid efficiency of people who'd practiced this exact scenario countless times. They entered Harbor Grill like weather systems, fundamentally altering the atmosphere just by existing. The lead agent, a black woman in her 40s with silver-touched braids and eyes that missed nothing, walked directly to Elias. "Mr. Brooks, I'm Special Agent Simone Park, Civil Rights Division. Your son briefed us en route. I need you to confirm. Are you the victim of an assault?" "Yes, ma'am." "And is the perpetrator present in this establishment?" Elias turned, looked directly at Trent Calloway. "Yes, ma'am, that man, Trent Calloway." Agent Park's gaze swung to Trent like a targeting laser. "Mr. Calloway, I'm placing you under federal investigation for potential violation of 18 U.S.C. Sever 249, the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act. You are not under arrest at this time, but you are required to remain on site and answer questions." Trent's legs gave out. He sat heavily in the nearest booth. Another agent, younger, Latino, nameplate reading Sanchez, began methodically photographing the scene. The broken glass, the scattered quarters, the blood drops on the floor. Everything. A third agent approached Lena. "Ma'am, I understand you have video evidence?" Lena nodded wordlessly, offering her phone. "I'll need to enter this into evidence. We'll get it back to you within 48 hours. Can you provide a written statement?" "Yes, absolutely. I saw everything." The agent turned to the rest of the diner's occupants. "Everyone in this establishment at the time of the incident is now a material witness. No one leaves until you've been interviewed. If you attempt to leave, you'll be detained. If you attempt to delete any photos, videos, or messages from your phones, you'll be charged with obstruction. I need everyone to place their phones on the tables in front of them. Now." The sound of phones hitting Formica filled the air. Outside, local police arrived. 2 cruisers, officers emerging with confused expressions that cleared instantly when they saw federal agents. A brief conversation ensued. Jurisdiction was established. The local cops became perimeter control, redirecting curious pedestrians, keeping people from entering or leaving. Noah kept filming until an agent approached the window and gestured for him to come inside. "You're the one with the camera," Agent Sanchez said. Not quite a question. "Yes, sir. I'm a film student. I was just documenting the town for a project." "Well, you just documented a federal hate crime. I'll need that footage." Noah handed over his camera with shaking hands. Is Mr. Brooks going to be okay?" "He will be." Sanchez's expression softened fractionally. "Thanks to you and others like you who didn't look away." While agents conducted interviews in separate booths, methodical, thorough, recording everything, a paramedic unit arrived to treat Elias's injuries. The cut required 7 stitches. The bruising would last weeks. The psychological impact, incalculable. Malcolm Brooks, reached by phone again as a preliminary report was compiled, gave one instruction to Agent Park. "I want every single frame of footage, every witness statement, every medical record. And I want to know who else in that diner has a history of similar incidents. This doesn't happen in isolation." "Understood, Director." "And Simone? Tell my father I'm proud of him, and I'll be there tomorrow." When she relayed the message, Elias closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, tears tracked silently through blood traces on his face. "Thank you," he whispered. By noon, Harbor Grill had been transformed into a crime scene. Yellow tape cordoned off the corner booth. Evidence markers numbered each relevant item. Witness interviews stretched into the afternoon. Agents taking down not just what people saw, but what they'd heard Trent say, what the atmosphere had been like, whether anyone had attempted to intervene. The answers painted a damning picture. No one helped. Yes, they'd heard the threats. Yes, they'd seen the shove, the slap, the blood. Yes, they'd done nothing. "Why?" Agent Park asked a retired teacher named Dorothy Mills, who'd been sitting 3 booths away. Dorothy's hands shook as she held her coffee cup. Because we don't get involved. That's just how things are here. You mind your business." "Even when someone's being assaulted?" "Especially then." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Especially if it's someone like Trent. His family's been here forever. You can't just..." "Can't just what, Mrs. Mills?" Can't just go against how things have always been. Agent Park made a note, then another. Her pen moved with the quiet fury of someone cataloging institutional rot. By the time witnesses were released, phones returned, stern warnings about federal law delivered, Ridgehaven's rumor mill had already begun grinding. The story spread through text messages, phone calls, frantic Facebook posts, and closed groups. Elias Brooks's son runs Homeland Security. Feds arrested Trent at Harbor Grill. They're investigating the whole town. We're all going to be questioned. Each retelling added new details, some true, some wildly speculative, but the core remained consistent. The quiet old black man they'd all dismissed had turned out to be connected to power they couldn't ignore, and now there would be consequences. That evening, as the sun set over Ridgehaven and federal agents packed evidence into secure containers, Elias Brooks sat in his small house on Oakwood Drive with a fresh bandage on his face and a glass of bourbon in his hand, Margaret's favorite, the bottle he saved for moments that demanded it. His phone rang. Malcolm, calling from D.C. How are you holding up, Dad? I'm all right, son. Been through worse. Korea was a war. This was a hate crime in your own town. Malcolm's voice carried weight. You don't have to minimize it. Not minimizing, just measuring. Elias took a slow sip. Malcolm, what happens now? Now? We build a case. Agent Park is thorough. She'll find every connection, every pattern. If Calloway's done this before, we'll know. If others were involved, we'll know. And we'll prosecute under federal hate crime statutes, which means real consequences. And the town? Silence on the line. Then, the town that watched you bleed and did nothing? The town where you've lived for 12 years and still get treated like an outsider? That town has a reckoning coming. I don't want revenge, Malcolm. I know, you never do, his son's voice gentled. But you deserve justice. And more than that, the next person who walks into Harbor Grill deserving respect deserves better than what you got. So we're going to make sure Ridgehaven understands that doing nothing isn't neutral. It's complicity. After they hung up, Elias sat in the gathering darkness, Margaret's photo on the mantel catching the last rays of sunlight. Well, love, he murmured to the empty room, you always said truth has a way of coming out. Guess you were right. The bourbon burned warm, the silence settled heavy, and somewhere in the distance, Ridgehaven held its breath, waiting for morning and whatever federal reckoning it would bring. But Elias Brooks, Purple Heart recipient, Korean War veteran, widower, father of a man who dedicated his life to civil rights. Elias Brooks had already survived worse than whatever came next. He'd survived because he'd learned long ago that dignity wasn't something others could grant or take away. It was something you carried inside, even when the world tried its damnedest to beat it out of you. And tomorrow, he'd wake up, put on a clean cardigan, and decide whether Harbor Grill deserved the grace of his return. Tonight, though, he'd let himself feel the weight of 72 years of holding steady in a country that kept testing whether he'd break. He hadn't. He wouldn't. And now, for the first time in Ridgehaven's long history of looking the other way, someone was finally going to look back. The morning after brought rain to Ridgehaven, the kind that turned dirt roads to mud and made the mountains disappear into low-hanging clouds. By 7 a.m., Harbor Grill should have been filling with the usual crowd. Contractors nursing hangovers, retirees arguing about yesterday's ballgame, the comfortable rhythm of a town that knew itself. Instead, the diner sat nearly empty. 3 customers huddled in separate booths, none making eye contact, none ordering more than coffee. The corner booth where Elias Brooks had bled remained cordoned off with yellow tape, a stark reminder that everything had changed. Lena Cruz arrived for her shift to find Sam Pritchard already behind the counter, face gray with exhaustion that suggested he hadn't slept. He looked up when the door chimed, something like relief flickering across his features. Lena, good. I wasn't sure you'd come. She unwound her scarf slowly, deliberately, letting the silence stretch. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a flatness that was somehow worse than anger. I need the money, Sam. My kids need to eat. That's the only reason I'm here. I know. He rubbed his face with both hands. Jesus, what a mess. A mess. Lena tied her apron with sharp, precise movements. That's what we're calling it. Not an assault? Not a hate crime that happened while you were in the back pretending not to hear? I didn't know it would. You knew exactly what Trent was doing. She turned to face him fully, years of swallowed frustration finally finding voice. You've known what he's been doing for years. We all have. The comments, the looks, the way he drives black families out of the hardware store, how he accidentally charges Latino customers double. You knew, Sam. You're his cousin. You've covered for him your whole life. Sam's jaw tightened. Family's complicated. So is paying my mortgage when the diner's only employer in town decides I'm a liability for telling the truth. Lena grabbed the coffee pot, her knuckles white around the handle. But here's what's less complicated. I recorded everything. I gave it to the FBI. And I'd do it again. Before Sam could respond, the door opened again, bringing with it a gust of cold rain and Agent Simone Park, water beading on her dark coat. She shook off her umbrella with practiced efficiency and approached the counter. Mr. Pritchard, Miss Cruz, I need both of you to come to the community center at 10 this morning. We're conducting follow-up interviews with all witnesses. Sam's face paled. I already gave a statement yesterday. And today you'll give another one. We've reviewed the security footage from your system, all of it, including the deleted files from the past 6 months. Park's smile held no warmth. Interesting what people think gets erased permanently when they empty the trash folder. We have specialists who retrieve that kind of data. You'd be surprised what we found. The coffee pot slipped slightly in Lena's grip. What did you find? Park's gaze shifted to her, softening fractionally. Nothing involving you, Ms. Cruz. Your record is clean. But we did find footage of 3 other incidents in this establishment over the past year. Incidents where customers were harassed, intimidated, or refused service based on what appears to be racial discrimination. None of those incidents were reported to police. Sam's voice came out strangled. People get into arguments sometimes. Doesn't mean... One of those incidents involved Trent Calloway threatening a black teenager for taking too long to count change. Another shows him blocking a Latino family from entering the restroom. The third... Park pulled out a tablet, tapped the screen, turned it to face Sam. The third shows you Mr. Pritchard telling a Muslim woman that her headscarf was making customers uncomfortable and asking her to leave. On the screen, grainy but unmistakable, Sam stood behind the counter telling a young woman in a hijab that perhaps she'd be more comfortable eating elsewhere. The timestamp read August 2024. That's not... Sam's protestations died under the weight of visual evidence. She was fine. She left on her own. After you made it clear she wasn't welcome. Park pocketed the tablet. Here's what's happening, Mr. Pritchard. The Department of Justice is opening a civil rights investigation into Harbor Grill and potentially other establishments in Ridgehaven. We're looking at patterns of discrimination, hostile environment, selective enforcement of policies. If we find systematic violations, and based on preliminary evidence we will, this business could face federal sanctions, fines, or forced closure pending remediation. The remaining customers in the diner had gone statue still, coffee cups frozen halfway to lips, breathing suspended. Sam groped for the counter edge, knees buckling. This will destroy me. The diner's all I have. It's been in my family for 50 years. Then your family should have treated all customers with equal dignity for 50 years. Park's tone offered no sympathy. 10 a.m., Mr. Pritchard. Community Center. Don't be late. She left as efficiently as she'd arrived, the door chiming behind her like a punctuation mark on Ridgehaven's former innocence. Lena and Sam stood in the sudden quiet, the weight of consequences settling between them like sediment. Lena, Sam started, voice cracking. I'm sorry. You should have done the right thing yesterday, or last month, or any of the dozen times before that. She poured herself coffee with hands that only trembled slightly. But you didn't. None of you did. And now the whole town's going to pay for pretending not to see. Across town, in a rented conference room at Ridgehaven's Lone Hotel, Malcolm Brooks spread evidence across a folding table with the methodical precision of someone assembling a case designed never to unravel. He'd driven through the night from D.C., arriving at dawn with 2 additional investigators and enough documentation to bury a small town in its own history. Agent Park entered carrying a box of files from local police archives, her expression grim. You're going to want to see these. Incident reports from the past 5 years that were either dismissed, downgraded, or never investigated. Malcolm took the top folder, scanned the first page, felt his jaw tighten. Harassment complaint filed by Jerome Walker, African American, age 63, claiming Trent Calloway threatened him at the gas station. Responding officer noted no witnesses, insufficient evidence. Case closed. Check the date. He did. March 2022, 2 years ago. He flipped to the next report. Vanessa Martinez, Latina, age 28, reported being followed by a truck matching Calloway's vehicle. Officer concluded it was coincidental route overlap. Jesus Christ. Park set the box down with a heavy thud. There are 47 reports in here. 47 instances where minorities in Ridgehaven filed complaints about harassment, intimidation, or discrimination. 47 cases where local PD found insufficient evidence or no basis for charges. But when I cross-reference the names of alleged perpetrators, 15 of them are the same group of men. Calloway, his cousin Kyle Drucker, Tom Bannister, the commissioner, and about a dozen others. A pattern. Malcolm's voice went cold with recognition. Coordinated. More than that. Look at this. She pulled out her tablet, showed him a screenshot of a private Facebook group called Ridgehaven First. We got a warrant for social media records. This group has 63 members, all local, all white, all men. They coordinate. Someone posts about a problem business, usually minority-owned or minority-friendly, and within days, that business faces code violations, health inspections, permit challenges, whatever it takes. Malcolm scrolled through the messages, bile rising in his throat. The casual racism was bad enough. Slurs, jokes, dehumanizing language that would have been shocking if he hadn't seen it countless times before in cases across the country. But the organization chilled him more. These weren't random bigots. They'd weaponized bureaucracy. One message from Tom Bannister read, "New halal market on Sycamore got approved. Time for a surprise inspection? Health code's pretty strict when we want it to be." Another from Kyle Drucker. "Martinez family keeps shopping at our store even after I told them to try Walmart. Maybe their car starts having trouble every time they park downtown." And from Trent Calloway, dated 3 months before the Harbor Grill assault. "Old black guy at the diner every morning like he owns the place. Nobody says anything. We're getting soft." Malcolm set the tablet down carefully before his hands could crush it. They hunted people. They systematically drove out anyone who didn't fit their vision of who Ridgehaven belonged to. And local law enforcement either participated or turned blind eyes. Park's expression hardened. Chief Morrison was in that Facebook group, so were 2 county commissioners, a school board member, and the owner of the town's only real estate agency. Which explains why minority families can't get housing here. Malcolm stood, paced the small room like a caged predator. They've created an entire infrastructure of exclusion, all operating under cover of community standards and property values. And my father walked into the middle of it. Your father, Park said quietly, survived it, because he's stronger than their hate, and because he raised a son who knows how to dismantle exactly this kind of operation. Malcolm stopped pacing, looked at the woman who'd worked with him for 6 years, who'd helped him build cases in towns from Georgia to Oregon, each one revealing the same ugly truth. Racism didn't need hoods and burning crosses anymore. It wore polo shirts and city council badges and hid behind words like heritage and tradition. "We're going to burn it down," he said softly. "Every piece. The Facebook group, the coordinated harassment, the selective enforcement. We're going to expose everyone involved and make sure the entire country sees what Ridgehaven really is." "Already started." Park's smile was sharp as broken glass. "I've got reporters from 3 national outlets calling my cell. The story leaked. Probably someone at the hospital where your father got stitches. By tonight, Ridgehaven's going to be famous for all the wrong reasons." At the Calloway residence, a rambling farmhouse on 10 acres his grandfather had cleared by hand, Trent sat at his kitchen table surrounded by family members who'd descended like vultures to a carcass. Except in this case, he was the carcass. His father, Dale Calloway, 71 years old and meaner than cancer, slammed a fist on the table hard enough to rattle coffee cups. How could you be so goddamn stupid? You assaulted a man whose son runs federal law enforcement? I didn't know. Trent's voice cracked under accumulated stress and sleeplessness. He's just some old... Don't. His mother, Patricia, cut him off with a tone that had cowed him since childhood. Don't finish that sentence. Don't say anything that can be used against you. The lawyers are coming, but until they get here, you shut your mouth. What lawyers can fight the feds? Trent laughed bitterly. You see those agents yesterday? They weren't local cops I could sweet talk. They looked at me like I was something they scraped off their shoes. Kyle Drucker, summoned for moral support, shifted uncomfortably in the corner. My dad says we need to stick together. United front. Say it was a misunderstanding that got blown out of proportion by outside agitators who don't understand how things work here. Outside agitators? Dale snorted. That what we're calling federal agents now? Boy, this isn't 1965. You can't just blame everything on civil rights workers and make it go away. Trent's sister Amy, who'd moved to Charlotte years ago and came back only for obligatory holidays, spoke up from her position leaning against the sink. Maybe this is exactly like 1965. Maybe Ridgehaven's been stuck there while the rest of the world moved on, and now reality's catching up. Patricia rounded on her. Don't you start with that liberal nonsense. This town raised you. Your people built it from nothing. Mom, your people built it on land they took and maintained it by keeping others out. Amy's voice held years of arguments compressed into one truth bomb. I left because I was tired of pretending that was okay. Trent stayed and made it worse. Now he's facing consequences, and honestly, it's about time. You ungrateful... I'm realistic. Amy pulled out her phone, showed them the screen. This is trending on Twitter. Veteran assaulted in Virginia diner. 15,000 retweets. CNN picked it up. So did MSNBC. By tomorrow, every news network in America will be talking about Ridgehaven, and it won't be positive. The room went silent as they passed around the phone, watching video footage that Noah Reed had uploaded. His camera's documentation of the assault seen through the diner window played and replayed, dissected in comment sections and cable news chyrons. Trent watched himself on the small screen, watched himself shove an elderly man, slap him hard enough to draw blood, stand over him with the posture of someone who'd done this before and expected no consequences. Watched the moment he'd destroyed his own life, playing on infinite loop for the world's judgment. Turn it off, he whispered. Please. But the video kept playing because the internet never forgot, and smartphones had made every public act a potential permanent record. At the community center, Agent Park and two other investigators set up interview stations while Ridgehaven citizens trickled in like defendants to sentencing. The atmosphere felt funeral heavy, people speaking in hushed voices, avoiding eye contact, each wondering how much trouble they were in. Dorothy Mills, the retired teacher who'd admitted to seeing everything and doing nothing, sat across from a young agent named Chen, who looked barely old enough to drink, but questioned with surgical precision. Mrs. Mills, you stated yesterday that you saw Mr. Calloway assault Mr. Brooks. Is that correct? Yes. Her voice barely carried across the table. And you stated that you didn't intervene because... Chen consulted notes. That's just how things are here. Can you elaborate? Dorothy's hands twisted in her lap. We don't interfere in other people's business, especially when it involves certain people. Certain people? You mean the Calloway family? I mean people who've been here forever, who have history. You can't just go against them without consequences. Chen leaned forward slightly. What kind of consequences, Mrs. Mills? Losing your job, having your property reassessed for higher taxes, suddenly failing health inspections, getting pulled over by police every time you drive, finding out your kids aren't getting into the good classes at school. The words tumbled out like water through a broken dam. You think that's coincidence? It's not. It's how things work. Step out of line, life gets harder. So it's an enforcement mechanism, social control through institutional pressure. It's survival. Dorothy's eyes finally met his, desperate for understanding. I'm 68 years old. I live on a pension. I can't afford to be the person who stands up and loses everything. That's easy to judge from outside, but you don't live here. You don't know what it costs. Chen made notes with a face that revealed nothing. Mrs. Mills, are you aware that failure to render aid or report a crime you witness can carry legal consequences? Her face crumpled. Am I going to jail? That's not my determination to make. But I need you to understand that what you're describing, this system of retaliation against people who challenge discrimination, that's criminal conspiracy. And everyone who participates, even passively, can be held accountable. In another room, Agent Park questioned Pastor Jim Havens with considerably less sympathy. You're a religious leader. You preach moral values, yet you sat in that booth and watched a man get assaulted without intervening. Jim's hands folded in what might have been prayer or simply anxiety. I was assessing the situation, trying to determine the best course of action. For 7 minutes? That's how long elapsed between when Mr. Calloway first approached Mr. Brooks and when he struck him. 7 minutes where you could have stood up, called for calm, physically placed yourself between them. You did none of those things. I didn't want to escalate. You didn't want to risk your position. Park's interruption was scalpel sharp. We've reviewed your sermons, Pastor Havens. Last month you preached about traditional values and protecting our community's character. 2 weeks before that, you gave a sermon about the importance of standing firm against outside influences. Your church donated $5,000 to Trent Calloway's legal defense fund yesterday. Care to explain how that aligns with Christian charity? Jim's face flushed. We support our congregation members in times of trouble. Do you support all congregation members equally? Because I noticed Mr. Brooks attended your church twice. Both times he was seated in the back. Both times no one spoke to him during fellowship hour. He stopped attending after the second visit. Did you reach out to ask why? Silence. Did you welcome him the way you welcome white visitors? More silence. That's what I thought. Park stood, signaling the interview's end. We'll be in touch, Pastor. In the meantime, I'd suggest you spend some time reflecting on what values you actually stand for versus which ones you just preach. Throughout the day, the interviews revealed the same patterns: complicity, rationalization, fear of retaliation, and underneath it all, a bedrock assumption that some people mattered more than others, and that was just the natural order of things. By 4 p.m., when the last witness left, Agent Park and Malcolm Brooks sat in the empty community center, surrounded by boxes of evidence and pages of testimony that painted Ridgehaven not as a charming mountain town, but as a place where injustice had become infrastructure. We have enough, Park said flatly. Enough to charge Calloway with federal hate crimes. Enough to investigate the police department for civil rights violations. Enough to recommend the DOJ pursue a pattern or practice investigation of the entire municipality. Malcolm nodded slowly, exhaustion pulling at him. And my father? Your father, she said gently, wants to know if he can come home. He called me an hour ago, asked if it was safe for him to return to his house or if he should stay with you in D.C. until this settles. The question hit Malcolm like a physical blow. His father, Purple Heart recipient, man who'd faced enemy fire in frozen Korean mountains, who'd raised 3 kids while working 2 jobs, who'd buried a wife and kept living anyway, was asking if his own town was safe. Tell him, Malcolm said, voice rough with suppressed emotion, tell him he can come home. And tell him that by the time we're finished, Ridgehaven will either learn to deserve him or it'll cease to exist as it currently does. As evening fell and federal investigators packed up their equipment, Ridgehaven itself seemed to huddle against the coming storm. Lights flickered on in homes where families argued about what to do, whether to cooperate with the investigation or circle the wagons. In the Calloway farmhouse, expensive lawyers from Richmond arrived with briefcases full of strategy and billable hours. At Harbor Grill, Sam Pritchard counted receipts from the slowest day in the diner's history and wondered if tomorrow would be worse. And in his small house on Oakwood Drive, Elias Brooks sat in his living room with a fresh bandage on his face, Malcolm's reassurance still echoing in his ear, and made a decision that would define everything that followed. He would go back to Harbor Grill tomorrow morning. Same time, same seat, same order. Not because he wanted to, not because it would be comfortable, but because running would mean they'd won, and 72 years of refusing to let hatred drive him from spaces he had every right to occupy wasn't going to end now. He'd order black coffee and wheat toast. He'd tip Lena exactly 20%. He'd read his paperback Western while Ridgehaven wrestled with the consequences of its choices. And if they didn't like it, they could take it up with the federal government. The decision made, Elias slept better than he had in 48 hours, waking before dawn to the sound of rain still drumming against his roof. He dressed with the same careful attention he'd given to his uniform 50 years ago: pressed slacks, a clean button-down shirt, the navy cardigan Margaret had given him for their 40th anniversary. The bandage on his face was smaller now, 7 stitches holding together what Trent Calloway's hatred had split open. He arrived at Harbor Grill at 7 sharp, parking his '98 Buick in the same spot he always used. Through the rain-streaked windshield, he could see the diner's interior, nearly empty again, Lena moving between tables with the mechanical efficiency of someone going through motions while her mind worked elsewhere. The door chimed when he entered. Every head turned. The 3 customers present, none of whom had been there during the assault, stared with expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort to something that might have been shame by proxy. Lena froze mid-pour at the counter, coffee pot suspended in air, her face cycling through surprise, concern, and then fierce determination. "Mr. Brooks." She set the pot down, crossed the distance between them in 4 strides, and did something she'd never done before. Pulled him into a brief, fierce hug. When she stepped back, her eyes were wet. "I didn't think you'd come back." "I live here," Elias said simply. "Same as anyone." "Your usual seat's still taped off. Evidence." She gestured toward the corner booth, yellow tape stark against red vinyl. "But I can seat you anywhere else." Elias surveyed the diner, all the empty tables, all the available space. Then he pointed to the booth directly adjacent to the crime scene tape. "There. That'll do fine." Something like pride flickered across Lena's features. Black coffee, wheat toast, 2 scrambled eggs. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." As he settled into the booth, the other customer's stares felt like physical weight. He pulled out his paperback, a Louis L'Amour he'd been working through for weeks, and opened to his marked page, a gesture of normalcy that declared he wasn't going anywhere. Sam Pritchard emerged from the kitchen, dish towel in hands, face pale as skimmed milk. He approached Elias's table with the hesitant steps of a man walking toward judgment. "Mr. Brooks, I owe you an apology." Elias looked up from his book, expression neutral. "You owe me considerably more than that, Mr. Pritchard." Sam flinched but held his ground. "You're right, I do. I've been thinking about what Agent Park said, about the other incidents, about how I looked the other way or made excuses or actively participated in making people feel unwelcome." He swallowed hard. "There's no excuse for it. I was wrong. I've been wrong for years." "Why tell me this?" Elias asked quietly. "Why now, after federal agents showed up with evidence that could shut you down?" "Because I'm hoping it's not too late to do better." Sam's voice cracked slightly. "I know that sounds self-serving. I know I should have done better before any of this happened. But I'm asking anyway, is there a path forward where I can make amends? Where this diner can be what it should have been all along, a place that welcomes everyone?" Elias studied the man before him, middle-aged, soft around the middle, wearing the weight of generational guilt like an ill-fitting coat. In Sam's face, he saw every white person who'd ever claimed ignorance, every institution that had looked away, every system that perpetuated harm through passive compliance. But he also saw, perhaps, the possibility of something else. Not redemption. That would take years of sustained action, not one conversation, but maybe the first stumbling step toward it. "You want a path forward, Mr. Pritchard? Here it is." Elias's voice carried the authority of someone who'd earned the right to set terms. "First, you cooperate fully with the federal investigation. No holding back, no protecting people who don't deserve it. Second, you implement real changes, staff training on discrimination, clear policies, public accountability. Third, you reach out to every person your diner made feel unwelcome and you apologize, personally, with no expectation of forgiveness." Sam nodded, pulling out a small notebook, writing quickly. "Fourth," Elias continued, "you use whatever platform you have to tell other business owners in this town that the old way of doing things is over, that silence is complicity, that Ridgehaven either becomes a place that treats all people with dignity or it becomes a cautionary tale." "I can do that. I will do that." "And fifth," Elias's gaze hardened, You stop expecting credit for basic human decency. You don't get a parade for finally treating people right. You just do it every day until it becomes who you actually are instead of who you're pretending to be to avoid federal charges. The words landed like hammer blows. Sam absorbed them, nodded once more, and retreated to the kitchen without another word. Lena brought Elias's coffee with hands that shook slightly. That was something. That was necessary. Elias took a sip, let the bitter heat ground him. Question is whether he means it or whether he's just scared. Can it be both? I suppose it can. Fear's a motivator, just not a very noble one. The door chimed again. Malcolm Brooks entered, shaking rain from his coat, and the temperature in the diner seemed to drop 10 degrees. He was tall like his father, with the same careful posture. But where Elias carried quiet dignity, Malcolm radiated controlled authority that made even innocent bystanders feel the need to check their consciences. He crossed directly to his father's booth, bent to examine the healing cut on Elias's face with gentle fingers and a professional's assessment. Healing clean, no signs of infection. He slid into the opposite seat, his back to the wall in unconscious mimicry of his father's positioning. How are you really? Tired, angry, determined. Elias offered a small smile. So, about normal for a Tuesday. Malcolm didn't return the smile. I've been reviewing evidence all night. Dad, what they did to you is part of a pattern that goes back years. Decades, probably. This town has been systematically excluding and harassing minorities through coordinated effort. It's not just Trent Calloway. It's an entire infrastructure. I know, son. I've lived here 12 years. You think I didn't notice? Then why stay? The question hung between them, weighted with years of similar conversations. Malcolm in D.C., offering his father a room, a fresh start, somewhere safer. Elias declining every time, stubborn as bedrock. Because running from a place doesn't change it, Elias said finally. It just leaves it exactly as it is for the next person who can't afford to leave. Margaret and I chose Ridgehaven because it was beautiful and quiet, and we thought we could make a life here. When she got sick, the hospital in Smithen took good care of her. Some of the nurses were kind. Some neighbors brought casseroles. It wasn't all bad, but it wasn't all good either. No, it wasn't. Elias met his son's eyes. But I'm not going to let the Trent Calloways of the world decide where I'm allowed to exist. That's what they want, for people like me to disappear, move away, make their discomfort someone else's problem. I won't do it. Malcolm's expression softened with reluctant understanding. You're the most stubborn man I've ever met. Learned it from your mother. She wouldn't back down either. Lena approached with a second cup, offered it to Malcolm. Coffee? On the house. Thank you, Ms. Cruz. I appreciate what you did. The recording you provided is critical evidence. She nodded, uncomfortable with the praise. Just did what was right. Should have done it sooner, honestly. Should have said something the first time I saw Trent give someone a hard time. You did it when it mattered most. That counts. After she left, Malcolm pulled out his tablet, showed his father a series of documents. This is what we're dealing with. Private Facebook group coordinating harassment, police reports that were deliberately buried, financial pressure on minority-owned businesses. It's systematic, Dad, and it's not just Ridgehaven. We're finding connections to similar groups in 3 neighboring counties. Elias scrolled through the screenshots, each one a small violence, the casual cruelty of people who believed they were entitled to decide who belonged. His jaw tightened reading messages about his own presence at Harbor Grill, the way they discussed him like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. What's the plan? He asked quietly. We're filing federal hate crime charges against Trent Calloway. That's certain. Maximum penalties, up to 10 years, significant fines. Beyond that, we're pursuing a pattern or practice investigation of Ridgehaven's police department, which could result in federal oversight or consent decrees. And we're examining potential civil rights violations by local officials who participated in the coordination. In other words, you're going to turn this town inside out. I'm going to hold people accountable for their choices. Malcolm's voice carried steel. They built this system. They maintained it. They profited from it. Now they'll face consequences. Before Elias could respond, the door chimed once more. This time, 3 people entered together, A young black couple in their 30s and an older Latino man, all moving with the uncertain energy of people entering hostile territory. They paused just inside the doorway, taking in the scene. Elias and Malcolm in the booth, the crime scene tape still visible, the handful of white customers watching with guarded expressions. The woman spoke first, voice carrying despite obvious nerves. Are we welcome here? Lena appeared instantly, professional warmth coating whatever anxiety she felt. Of course. Seat yourselves anywhere. But it was Elias who stood, crossing to them with extended hand. You're absolutely welcome. I'm Elias Brooks. This is my son Malcolm. Please join us if you'd like. The couple exchanged glances, surprise and relief mixing. The man shook Elias's hand firmly. Jerome Walker, this is my wife, Shanice. We live over in Smithton, but we heard about what happened here. Heard you came back, wanted to show support. The Latino man nodded. Carlos Mendoza. I filed a complaint against Trent Calloway 2 years ago. Police did nothing. When I saw the news, I thought maybe finally someone would listen. Malcolm stood, immediately in investigator mode. Mr. Mendoza, I'd very much like to hear about your experience. Would you be willing to give a formal statement? Already did to Agent Park yesterday. She called me after she found my name in the police files. But I'll tell it again. I'll tell it as many times as it takes. They settled into the booth, pushing 2 tables together, and suddenly Harbor Grill looked different. Not a white space grudgingly tolerating intrusion, but a genuinely shared space where people of different backgrounds sat together over coffee and conversation. Other customers watched with expressions ranging from confusion to discomfort to, in one older woman's case, tentative approval. She caught Elias's eye, nodded once, a small gesture that felt monumental. Over the next hour, more people trickled in. Some were Ridgehaven residents who'd stayed silent during the assault and now seemed desperate to demonstrate they'd changed. Others were from neighboring towns drawn by news coverage, wanting to witness or participate in whatever transformation was happening. Noah Reed arrived with his camera, this time asking permission before filming. Mr. Brooks, would you be comfortable with me documenting this? The contrast between 2 days ago and now, it's important. Elias considered, then nodded. Just keep it honest. Don't make me into something I'm not. I'm just a man who wanted breakfast. You're a man who wouldn't be moved, Noah corrected gently. That matters. By 9 a.m., Harbor Grill was fuller than it had been in days, the crowd a mix of races and backgrounds that Ridgehaven had probably never seen under one roof. The conversations were careful, awkward in places, but genuine. People sharing stories of exclusion, of times they'd been made to feel unwelcome, of small cruelties that had accumulated into larger wounds. Sam Pritchard watched from behind the counter, overwhelmed and possibly recognizing for the first time what his diner could have been all along. But outside, not everyone welcomed the change. A small group had gathered across the street, maybe a dozen people, some holding hastily made signs reading Ridgehaven for Ridgehaveners and outside agitators go home. They didn't approach, didn't shout, just stood in the rain, making their presence and their position clear. Malcolm saw them first, jaw tightening. Dad, I see them. Elias's voice stayed calm. Let them stand there. They're entitled to their opinion, however wrong it is. They're also creating a potentially threatening environment. Malcolm pulled out his phone, made a call. I'm requesting a federal presence, just a precaution. Within 20 minutes, 2 FBI vehicles parked strategically between the diner and the protesters, not engaging, just visible, a reminder that the rules had changed. Agent Park entered the diner, spotted Malcolm, and joined their table. The prosecutor called. Grand jury's convening next week for the Calloway case. They're confident about indictment. Shanice Walker leaned forward. What about the others, the people who participated in that Facebook group? That's more complicated, Park admitted. Conspiracy charges are harder to prove, but we're building cases. Some will face federal charges. Others might face state charges for harassment, stalking, or civil rights violations. A few might escape legal consequences, but face professional or social ones. The school board member already resigned this morning. And the police chief, Carlos asked, the one who buried my complaint? Under investigation. If we find sufficient evidence of civil rights violations, he'll face charges. At minimum, he'll likely be forced out. The door opened again, And this time the person who entered made the entire diner go silent. Dorothy Mills, the retired teacher who'd admitted to seeing everything and doing nothing, stood in the doorway with rain dripping from her coat and an expression of such profound discomfort that it bordered on pain. She spotted Elias, seemed to gather courage from some deep well, and approached his table. "Mr. Brooks, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I needed to tell you, in person, that I'm ashamed. I saw what happened. I did nothing. I've spent 2 days trying to justify it to myself, and I can't. There's no justification. I was a coward." The diner held its breath. Elias looked at her for a long moment, measuring sincerity against self-interest, real remorse against performative guilt. Finally, he gestured to an empty chair. "Sit down, Mrs. Mills." She did, hands trembling. "You're right," Elias said quietly. "You were a coward. You prioritized your comfort over my safety. That's the truth, and we're not going to pretty it up." Dorothy's face crumpled, but she nodded. "But," Elias continued, "you're here now. You're naming what you did wrong. That's a start. A small start, but a start nonetheless. The question is what you do next." "I don't know what to do next," she whispered. "I'm 68 years old. I've lived my whole life in Ridgehaven, going along, not making waves. How do I change that?" Malcolm spoke up, voice gentler than his usual professional tone. "You start by telling the truth. When people make excuses for what happened, you correct them. When someone makes a racist comment in the grocery store, you speak up instead of pretending you didn't hear. When the next minority family moves to town, you welcome them loudly and publicly. You use whatever social capital you have to make it clear that silence is no longer acceptable." "And when people don't like it?" Dorothy asked. "When I lose friends or get excluded from the bridge club or—" "Then you'll know what Mr. Brooks has felt for 12 years, Shanice said bluntly. "What my husband felt when he was threatened for existing. What Carlos felt when his complaint disappeared into thin air. You'll get a tiny taste of what it's like to be on the outside, and maybe that'll teach you something." The words were harsh but necessary. Dorothy absorbed them, nodded slowly, and stood. "Thank you for not throwing me out. I know you could have." "Everyone gets a chance to do better," Elias said. "But only one chance. Don't waste it." After she left, Jerome shook his head in wonder. "You're more gracious than I'd be." "Not grace. Strategy." Elias's smile held no humor. "Change doesn't come from punishing everyone who ever did wrong. It comes from giving people a path to be better while making it clear that staying the same is no longer tolerable. Mrs. Mills wants to change? Fine. Let her prove it through action, but I'm not going to coddle her through the process." The morning stretched into afternoon, the diner slowly emptying as people returned to jobs and obligations but promising to come back, to keep showing up, to make Harbor Grill into what it should have been all along. By 2 p.m., only Elias, Malcolm, and Lena remained. The lunch rush had been modest but real. More people than Sam had seen in days, some motivated by curiosity, others by genuine support. Malcolm checked his watch. "I need to get back to Richmond. Conference call with the DOJ at 4. But Dad, I want you to promise me something." "What's that?" "If anything happens, anything that makes you feel unsafe, you call me immediately. No waiting, no trying to handle it yourself. You call." "I've been taking care of myself for 72 years, son." "I know, but you don't have to anymore. Not alone." Malcolm stood, pulled his father into a brief, fierce embrace. "I'm proud of you. Mom would be too." Elias's eyes misted briefly. "She'd tell me I was being stubborn and foolish. And then she'd stand right next to you being exactly the same way." Malcolm managed a real smile. "I'll call tonight." After he left, Lena refilled Elias's coffee, his 4th cup well past his usual limit. "You okay, Mr. Brooks?" "Tired, but yeah, I'm okay. Can I ask you something?" She slid into the booth across from him, an intimacy she'd never presumed before. "Why didn't you fight back? When Trent shoved you, hit you, you're a veteran, you've got training, you could have defended yourself." Elias traced the rim of his coffee cup, considering his answer. "Because the moment I fought back, I would have become the aggressor in their eyes. Old black man attacks white pillar of the community. Suddenly, I'm the problem, and everything that happened before gets erased. I've lived through enough to know that defending yourself while black is often treated as the real crime. That's not fair. No, it's not. But it's reality. So instead, I stayed calm. I documented. I called someone who could bring real consequences. And now Trent Calloway is facing federal charges instead of me facing assault charges for defending myself. He met her eyes. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is refuse to give them the excuse they're looking for. Lena absorbed this, the lesson in it, the decades of survival strategy compressed into one explanation. You shouldn't have had to calculate like that. You should have just been able to eat breakfast. Yes, I should have, and maybe someday someone will. Elias finished his coffee, set the cup down with finality. That's why we don't give up. That's why we keep showing up, keep demanding better, keep refusing to disappear just because our presence makes people uncomfortable. Because every time we do, we make it a little easier for the next person. He stood, left exact change for the meal plus Lena's tip, and walked toward the door. Paused at the threshold, looked back at the diner. The corner booth with its crime scene tape, the tables where unlikely alliances had formed over coffee, the space that had been hostile and was slowly, painfully becoming something else. See you tomorrow, Lena. Same time, same order? Same time, same order. The door chimed behind him, and Elias stepped out into the afternoon rain, adjusted his cardigan, and walked toward his Buick with the steady pace of a man who'd survived worse and would survive whatever came next. Behind him, Ridgehaven wrestled with its conscience. Some would resist, clinging to the old ways until legal or social consequences pried their fingers loose. Others would adapt out of fear rather than conviction, performing tolerance while harboring resentment. A few, just a few, might actually change, might recognize that treating all people with dignity wasn't a burden, but a relief. A release from the exhausting work of maintaining hierarchies that benefited no one in the end. Which category would prevail remained to be seen. But Elias Brooks had cast his vote with his presence, his persistence, his refusal to grant hatred the victory of his absence. And tomorrow, he'd do it again. The week that followed moved with the inexorable momentum of an avalanche, slow at first, then gathering speed and weight until nothing could stop it. Elias maintained his routine with military precision, arriving at Harbor Grill each morning at 7, taking his booth, ordering his breakfast, existing with the quiet defiance of a man who refused to be erased. Some days the diner was nearly full with supporters. Other days it was empty except for him and Lena and the weight of Ridgehaven's reckoning hanging in the air like smoke. On Thursday morning, the grand jury returned indictments. Trent Calloway was formally charged with federal hate crimes under 18 U.S.C.'s SHR 249, along with assault causing bodily injury and conspiracy to violate civil rights. The news broke at 9 a.m., and by 9:30, reporters had descended on Ridgehaven like a biblical plague, news vans clogging Main Street, cameras pointed at storefronts, journalists stopping anyone willing to talk. Elias watched the circus from his booth, sipping coffee, while outside his window, a CNN correspondent delivered a stand-up report with Harbor Grill's vintage sign perfectly framed in the background. This is what happens when a single act of violence reveals a system of oppression, the reporter said into the camera, earnest and perfectly coiffed. Behind me is the diner where 72-year-old veteran Elias Brooks was assaulted. But as federal investigators dig deeper, they're finding that assault was merely one thread in a complex web of coordinated discrimination that may have been operating in this small Virginia town for decades. Sam emerged from the kitchen, watched the broadcast through the window with an expression somewhere between horror and resignation. They're going to destroy us. Lena, refilling sugar dispensers, didn't look up. You destroyed yourselves. They're just reporting it. Inside the Ridgehaven Police Department, Chief Robert Morrison sat in his office surrounded by boxes of files he'd been ordered to preserve for federal review. Agent Park and 2 DOJ attorneys had arrived at 8 a.m. with a warrant so comprehensive it essentially gave them access to everything the department had touched in 5 years. Morrison was 61, a lifelong resident who'd risen through the ranks on the strength of family connections and the kind of reliable mediocrity that small towns rewarded. He genuinely believed he was doing his job well, keeping the peace, maintaining order, protecting Ridgehaven's character. That the peace was one-sided and the order was discriminatory, and the character he'd protected was poisonous, had somehow never fully penetrated his awareness. Now, watching federal agents photograph every file cabinet, image every hard drive, catalog every piece of potential evidence, reality, crashed through his carefully maintained ignorance like a battering ram through rotted wood. "Chief Morrison," Agent Park said, voice clinical and precise, "we found 63 incident reports filed by minority residents over the past 5 years. Of those 63, only 4 resulted in any investigation whatsoever, and 0 resulted in charges. Can you explain that discrepancy?" Morrison's lawyer, a harried woman named Patricia Vance, who'd driven up from Roanoke that morning, placed a hand on his arm. "Don't answer that. We're not in a courtroom, Ms. Vance. Your client isn't under arrest. Yet." Park pulled out a printed spreadsheet, set it on Morrison's desk with the delicate precision of someone handling evidence at a crime scene. "But let me share what we've found. When white residents file complaints, investigations are opened 87% of the time. When black residents file complaints, investigations are opened 6% of the time. When Latino residents file complaints, the rate drops to 3%. Those aren't coincidences. That's policy." "That's not policy," Morrison protested, voice cracking. "That's just, we have limited resources. We have to prioritize based on race. Yes, we understand." One of the DOJ attorneys, a young black man named Marcus Green, who'd cut his teeth prosecuting police misconduct in 3 states, leaned forward. "Chief, we've also found communications between you and members of the Ridgehaven First Facebook group. Messages where you explicitly discuss problem families and appropriate responses. Would you like to explain those?" Morrison's face went gray. The messages he'd thought were private conversations between friends, the casual coordination that had seemed so reasonable at the time, now sat in federal hands being interpreted not as community protection, but as conspiracy. "I want immunity," he said suddenly, ignoring his lawyer's sharp intake of breath. "I'll cooperate fully, tell you everything I know, testify if needed. But I want immunity from prosecution." Park and Green exchanged glances, a conversation happening in the space between heartbeats. "We can recommend consideration of immunity in exchange for cooperation," Park said carefully. "But that decision comes from the U.S. Attorney's Office, and it depends on the value of your cooperation and the severity of your involvement. Start talking. We'll see what you're worth." Morrison talked for 6 hours, pausing only when his lawyer insisted or when agents needed to verify his claims against existing evidence. He named names, described the informal network that had operated for years, explained how certain businesses were targeted for code violations and others were overlooked, how traffic stops were used to harass and intimidate, how the appearance of equal enforcement masked systematic bias. It poured out of him like infection from a lanced wound. Ugly, necessary, the only path to healing, even if the healing would be agonizing. By evening, when the first interview session concluded, Park had enough to expand the investigation to include 2 county commissioners, the head of the Planning and Zoning Board, the owner of the town's largest real estate firm, and 7 officers in Morrison's department. "Jesus," Green muttered as they packed up equipment. "This goes deeper than I thought. They built an entire parallel system." "They always do," Park said quietly. "Racism doesn't need grand conspiracies. It just needs people who benefit from the status quo deciding that maintaining their comfort is more important than other people's rights. Then they build institutions to protect that choice, and suddenly it's not personal bias anymore. It's just how things work." That evening, Ridgehaven's town council held an emergency meeting in the community center, ostensibly to discuss the town's response to federal investigation. In reality, it became a referendum on Ridgehaven's soul. The room was packed beyond capacity, standing room only, people spilling into the hallway. Reporters lined the back wall, cameras recording everything. The council members, 5 white men who'd governed through consensus and cronyism for years, sat behind a folding table looking like defendants awaiting sentencing. Tom Bannister, the commissioner who'd been in Harbor Grill during the assault, called the meeting to order with a voice that shook slightly. "We're here tonight to address the ongoing federal investigation and discuss how Ridgehaven moves forward. I want to start by saying that the actions of one individual stop. The voice came from the third row, Jerome Walker, standing with his wife Shanice, both of them radiating the kind of anger that came from years of accumulated indignities finally finding outlet. You don't get to blame this on one person. You were there, Commissioner Bannister. You sat in that booth while Trent Calloway assaulted an elderly veteran, and you did nothing. That makes you complicit. The room erupted. Some people applauding, others shouting objections, the careful veneer of civility cracking like old paint. Bannister's face flushed. I understand emotions are running high. This isn't emotion. This is fact. Carlos Mendoza stood next, holding a folder thick with documents. I filed a complaint against Trent Calloway 2 years ago. Detailed harassment, threats, damage to my property. Chief Morrison told me there was insufficient evidence, but I kept records. I have photos, dates, witnesses, everything the police said didn't exist. I've given it all to the FBI. More voices joined in, a chorus of experiences that had been dismissed or ignored, each person standing to bear witness to a system that had worked exactly as designed, just not for everyone. An elderly black woman named Ruth Patterson, who'd lived in Ridgehaven longer than most council members had been alive, stood with the aid of a cane and the authority of someone who'd earned the right to be heard. I've been here 64 years, she said, voice carrying despite her age. Moved here in 1961 with my late husband, thought we'd found a place to build a life. And we did, but only by making ourselves small, by accepting less, by teaching our children to be twice as good and expect half as much. I watched this town push out black families, Latino families, anyone who didn't fit the picture you wanted. And I stayed quiet because I was tired of fighting, tired of being the only one willing to say the truth out loud. She paused, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. But I'm not staying quiet anymore. None of us are. What happened to Elias Brooks could have happened to any of us. It should have happened to none of us. And if this investigation burns this town to the ground, maybe that's what needs to happen so something better can grow in its place. The applause was deafening. Bannister attempted to regain control. I hear your concerns, and the council is committed to making changes. You're committed to avoiding federal charges, shouted a voice from the back. Don't pretend this is about morality. You're scared. Damn right we're scared. Bannister's composure finally shattered completely. You want honesty? Fine. The town's facing potential federal oversight, consent decrees, lawsuits that could bankrupt us. Property values are already dropping. Businesses are talking about leaving. This could destroy Ridgehaven economically. Then maybe Ridgehaven deserves to be destroyed, Shanice said coldly. If the only way this town can survive is by oppressing people, then it doesn't deserve to survive. Into the chaos, a new voice spoke, quiet but carrying weight that silenced the room through sheer moral authority. Elias Brooks stood in the doorway, Malcolm beside him, both of them still in damp coats from the rain that had started again outside. No one had noticed them arrive, but now every eye turned their direction. Elias walked slowly to the front of the room, movements deliberate, the healing cut on his face visible under fluorescent lights. He stopped directly in front of the council table, met each member's eyes in turn. My name is Elias Brooks. Most of you know that now, though few of you knew it before my son's position made me matter to you. I'm the man who was assaulted in Harbor Grill. I'm also the man who's lived in Ridgehaven for 12 years, paid taxes for 12 years, voted in local elections for 12 years, and been treated like a temporary inconvenience for 12 years. His voice was steady, conversational even, which somehow made his words cut deeper than shouting would have. Commissioner Bannister is right about one thing. Ridgehaven is facing consequences. Economic, legal, social consequences that will change this town fundamentally. And yes, those consequences will hurt. People will lose jobs. Businesses might close. Property values might drop. That's the price of building a community on the foundation of exclusion. He paused, letting that sink in. But here's what you need to understand. This town can survive. It can even thrive. Just not the way it was. You can't keep the comfort of the old Ridgehaven, where certain people mattered and others didn't, where power protected its own and everyone else scrambled for scraps. That version is over. What happens next depends on whether you're willing to build something better or whether you're going to spend years fighting to preserve a system that was rotten from the foundation. Tom Bannister found his voice, smaller now, stripped of bluster. "What would you have us do, Mr. Brooks?" "Tell the truth. All of it. Stop protecting people who don't deserve protection. Cooperate fully with federal investigators. Implement real reforms with real oversight. Make amends to the people you've harmed. And accept that you don't get to control the narrative anymore. The rest of us get voices too." Malcolm stepped forward, professional authority reasserting itself. "The Department of Justice will be announcing additional charges tomorrow. Multiple individuals will be indicted for civil rights violations, conspiracy, and abuse of authority. The town of Ridgehaven will be subject to a consent decree requiring comprehensive police reform, fair housing enforcement, and independent monitoring. These are not negotiable terms. They are the minimum requirements for the federal government to allow you to continue governing yourselves." The room absorbed this like a physical blow. "However," Malcolm continued, "there is a path forward. Other towns have faced similar reckonings and emerged stronger, but it requires genuine commitment to change, not performative gestures designed to minimize legal exposure. It requires admitting what you did wrong, understanding why it was wrong, and doing the hard work of becoming better." He looked at his father, something like pride and pain mixing in his expression. "My father could have left Ridgehaven the day after he was assaulted. He could have gone anywhere, lived with me in D.C., started over somewhere that would welcome him from day one. He chose to stay. Not because he's stubborn, though he is. Not because he's forgiving, though he's more gracious than most of you deserve. But because he believes, still believes, despite everything, that people can change, that communities can change, that Ridgehaven can become what it should have been all along." Elias picked up the thread. "But my belief has limits, and my patience has an ending. You have one chance to prove that belief isn't misplaced. One chance to show that Ridgehaven can be a place where all people are treated with dignity, regardless of their race or background or how long they've been here. Waste that chance, and my son will ensure this town becomes a textbook example of what happens when communities choose hate over humanity." The meeting continued for another 2 hours, but the essential battle was over. Voices that had been loud in defense of the status quo grew quieter. People who'd been ready to dismiss the investigation as outside interference began asking harder questions of their leaders. The tide hadn't fully turned, but it had shifted, and everyone in the room could feel the current pulling in a new direction. By the time the meeting adjourned near midnight, 3 things were clear. The council would vote to cooperate fully with federal investigators. Chief Morrison would be placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the DOJ investigation, and Ridgehaven would never be the same. Outside, as people filtered into the rain-slick parking lot, Dorothy Mills approached Elias with the hesitant steps of someone still learning how to walk new ground. "Mr. Brooks, I just want you to know I spoke up tonight. When people tried to minimize what happened, I corrected them. It's not much, but it's a start," Elias said, echoing his words from days before. "Keep going." She nodded, managed a tremulous smile, and walked toward her car with slightly straighter shoulders. Jerome and Shanice Walker waited nearby, wanting to speak but unsure what to say. Finally, Jerome managed, "You gave them more grace than they earned." "Maybe," Elias acknowledged, "but grace isn't something you earn. It's something you give because the alternative, endless cycles of retribution, doesn't lead anywhere good. That doesn't mean no consequences. It means consequences aimed at transformation, not destruction." "And if they don't transform," Shanice asked. Malcolm answered before his father could. "Then the federal government will do it for them. One way or another, Ridgehaven will change. The only question is whether they participate in that change or have it imposed on them." The following morning brought another media storm. The additional indictments Malcolm had mentioned were unsealed at 9 a.m., and the list of names read like a directory of Ridgehaven's power structure. 2 county commissioners, the planning and zoning director, 4 police officers, the owner of Ridgehaven Realty, each charged with various combinations of civil rights violations, conspiracy, fraud, and abuse of authority. The courthouse in Smithton, where the initial hearings would be held, was mobbed with reporters and protesters, some supporting the defendants, claiming federal overreach and outside interference, others demanding accountability and wearing shirts that read "Justice for Elias" and "No More Silence." Inside, Trent Calloway stood before a federal magistrate, lawyer beside him, family in the gallery behind him, and heard the charges against him read in language that made his casual violence sound like what it actually was, a federal crime carrying serious prison time. Mr. Calloway, you are charged with willfully causing bodily injury to Elias Brooks because of his race, in violation of federal hate crime statutes. You are also charged with conspiracy to violate civil rights and assault resulting in bodily injury. How do you plead? Trent's lawyer, an expensive defense attorney from Richmond named Harrison Webb, who'd made a career out of defending the indefensible, spoke clearly, "Not guilty, Your Honor." The plea was expected, but it still sent ripples through the gallery. Margaret Brooks, Trent's mother, wept quietly into her hands. His father Dale sat stone-faced, fury barely contained. His sister Amy stared at the back of his head with an expression that mixed pity with something harder, more final, the look of someone cutting ties with family out of necessity. In the gallery's opposite side sat Elias, Malcolm, Lena Cruz, Jerome and Shanice Walker, Carlos Mendoza, and a dozen others whose presence declared that Trent wouldn't face just a courtroom, but a community that had finally found its voice. The magistrate set bail at $500,000, imposed travel restrictions, and scheduled a preliminary hearing for 3 weeks out. As Trent was led from the courtroom by U.S. Marshals, he'd make bail within hours, his family mortgaging property to secure it. He made eye contact with Elias for the first time since the assault. What passed between them in that moment was complex beyond words. Trent's expression held shock that consequences had actually arrived, resentment that his victim hadn't stayed silent, and somewhere beneath the anger, perhaps the first glimmer of recognition that he'd destroyed his own life with choices that had seemed so natural at the time. Elias looked back with something that wasn't forgiveness but wasn't hatred either, more like a surgeon's assessment of damage that needed repair, even if the repair would be painful and incomplete. Outside the courthouse, Malcolm gave a brief statement to the assembled media. Today's proceedings represent an important step toward accountability, but they are only a step. The Department of Justice's investigation into Ridgehaven continues. We are committed to ensuring that every person involved in systematic discrimination faces appropriate consequences, and that the structures that enabled this behavior are dismantled and rebuilt on foundations of equal justice. My father was assaulted because he had the audacity to exist in a space that some people believed he didn't belong. That belief didn't emerge from nowhere. It was taught, reinforced, institutionalized, and protected by people who should have known better. Those people will be held accountable. A reporter shouted a question. Director Brooks, some are calling this federal overreach. What's your response? Malcolm's expression hardened. When local institutions fail to provide equal protection under the law, when they actively participate in denying citizens their civil rights, federal intervention isn't overreach. It's necessity. The Constitution doesn't stop at county lines. Civil rights don't expire in small towns. And the federal government has both the authority and the obligation to enforce those rights when local governments won't. Mr. Brooks, another reporter called out, do you regret returning to Harbor Grill after the assault? Do you wish you'd just left Ridgehaven? Elias stepped up to the microphone cluster, Malcolm moving aside to give his father space. I don't regret standing my ground, Elias said clearly. What I regret is that standing my ground required federal intervention, national news coverage, and my son's position to make this town treat me like a human being. What I regret is the dozens of other people who experienced discrimination in Ridgehaven but didn't have resources or connections to fight back, who just had to absorb the injustice and move on. What I regret is that it took violence against a veteran to make people pay attention to a problem that's been obvious for years. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But I don't regret staying, because leaving would have meant Ridgehaven never had to confront what it is. And maybe, if enough people refuse to leave, refuse to be silent, refuse to accept less than the dignity and respect they deserve, places like Ridgehaven will have to change, not because they want to, but because they have no other choice. The reporters continued shouting questions, but Malcolm gently guided his father away from the cameras, toward the car where Agent Park waited to drive them back to Ridgehaven. On the drive back, as Virginia countryside rolled past the windows and rain continued its relentless percussion against the roof, Elias felt the weight of the past week settle into his bones. The adrenaline that had sustained him through confrontations and court appearances was draining away, leaving exhaustion in its wake. "You okay, Dad?" Malcolm asked quietly from the front seat. "Tired. So tired." Elias closed his eyes. "I keep thinking about Margaret, what she'd say about all this." "What do you think she'd say? That I'm making too much of a fuss, that I should just come live with you and let Ridgehaven sort itself out." A small smile. "Then she'd pack my bags, drive me there herself, and spend the whole trip telling me I was right to stay." Malcolm laughed, the sound carrying grief and love in equal measure. "That sounds exactly like Mom. She never let me take the easy path, always pushed me to stand up, speak out, be the man she knew I could be even when I wanted to just be left alone." Elias opened his eyes, looked at the rain. "I miss her, especially now. She'd be proud of you. Hell, I'm proud of you. Don't know that there's much to be proud of. I just wanted breakfast." "You wanted dignity," Malcolm corrected. "And when it was denied, you didn't accept that denial as the final word. That matters, Dad. More than you know." They drove in comfortable silence for a while, each processing the morning's events in their own way. Finally, as Ridgehaven's town limits sign appeared through the rain, Elias spoke again. "What happens now? After the trials, after the reforms, after the reporters leave and the federal agents go home?" Agent Park answered from the driver's seat. "Now comes the hardest part, actually changing. Laws can be enforced from outside, but culture has to change from within. Ridgehaven will have oversight, monitoring, consequences for backsliding. But whether the people genuinely become better or just learn to hide their bias better, that's up to them. And if they choose wrong, then we come back, again and again, as many times as it takes, until they learn that equal rights aren't negotiable and civil rights aren't favors to be granted or withdrawn based on who's in power." As they pulled up to Elias's house on Oakwood Drive, neighbors who'd never spoken to him in 12 years suddenly found reasons to be outside, checking mailboxes, walking dogs, tending gardens in the rain. Their eyes followed him with expressions ranging from curiosity to guilt to something that might have been tentative respect. Tomorrow, he'd return to Harbor Grill. Same time, same order, same quiet insistence on existing without permission or apology. But tonight, he'd rest. Let the weight settle. Let the stitches heal. Let his 72-year-old body and spirit recover from weathering yet another storm that he'd survived but shouldn't have had to face. He stood on his porch, watching Malcolm and Agent Park drive away, and felt the presence of all those who'd stood in similar places before him, facing similar injustices, finding similar strength, making similar choices between retreat and resistance. They'd chosen resistance. So had he. So would others who came after, until finally, maybe, the resistance wouldn't be necessary anymore. Until then, he'd keep showing up, keep existing, keep refusing to grant hatred the victory of his silence or his absence. Ridgehaven would change or it would crumble. Either outcome was progress. The trial began 6 months later on a crisp October morning when the leaves had turned gold and crimson and Ridgehaven looked like a postcard of small-town America, beautiful on the surface, complicated underneath. The federal courthouse in Charlottesville was chosen as the venue, both sides agreeing that holding the trial in Ridgehaven would make finding an impartial jury impossible. Elias sat in the gallery with Malcolm on one side and Lena on the other, watching as potential jurors filed in for voir dire. The process took 3 days. Harrison Webb systematically eliminating anyone who'd seen the viral video or expressed strong opinions about civil rights. The prosecution team, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Hassan, eliminating anyone who seemed dismissive of hate crime legislation or uncomfortable discussing race. By Thursday afternoon, they had 12 jurors and 4 alternates, a mix of ages, backgrounds, and perspectives that both sides could live with, if not love. The trial itself became a national spectacle, courtroom sketch artists capturing moments that cameras weren't allowed to record, legal analysts dissecting every motion and objection on cable news. But inside the courtroom, stripped of media hysteria, it was simply the machinery of justice grinding forward with methodical precision. Hassan's opening statement laid out the government's case with devastating clarity. "This is not a complicated case, ladies and gentlemen. The defendant, Trent Calloway, assaulted Elias Brooks, a 72-year-old veteran, in a public place in front of witnesses because of Mr. Brooks's race. We will prove this through video evidence, eyewitness testimony, medical records, and the defendant's own words. We will show you that this was not a momentary lapse in judgment, but the culmination of years of coordinated harassment targeting minorities in Ridgehaven. And we will prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Trent Calloway is guilty of federal hate crimes. Webb's opening countered with the desperation of a lawyer defending the indefensible. The prosecution wants you to see a hate crime. What actually happened was a regrettable altercation between two men who'd had previous tensions, escalated by Mr. Brooks's confrontational attitude and the defendant's admittedly poor judgment under stress. Was my client wrong to strike Mr. Brooks? Absolutely. Should he face consequences? Yes. But transforming a simple assault into a federal hate crime requires proving intent based on race, and the evidence simply doesn't support that leap. It was a strategy built on sand, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. The prosecution's case unfolded like a documentary, each piece of evidence reinforcing the last. Lena took the stand first, her testimony delivered with the quiet authority of someone who'd watched injustice unfold and refused to look away.
Keep it.
He called Mr. Brooks an old man counting quarters like a homeless person. He said Mr. Brooks didn't belong, that he should go somewhere that fits. He blocked him from leaving. And when Mr. Brooks tried to walk away peacefully, Trent shoved him into the table, then hit him hard enough to open his face. Her voice never wavered. I've worked at Harbor Grill for 6 years. I've seen Trent Calloway harass other customers, but I'd never seen him violent until that morning, and it was because Mr. Brooks refused to be intimidated. Webb tried to shake her on cross-examination, suggesting she'd misheard or misinterpreted, that her recording didn't capture everything. Lena didn't budge. I know what I saw. I know what I heard, and I know the difference between two people having an argument and one person systematically degrading another because of the color of his skin. Noah Reed followed, his video footage playing on screens throughout the courtroom, the shove, the slap, the blood, all of it captured through Harbor Grill's window in brutal clarity. The jury watched in silence, several members visibly disturbed. Why were you filming? Hassan asked. I was documenting small-town America for a class project. I thought I'd capture nostalgic moments, people eating breakfast, community gathering places. Noah's voice carried the weight of lost innocence. Instead, I documented a hate crime. And I'm glad I did, because without that video, Mr. Brooks might have been dismissed or blamed. At least now there's proof. The medical examiner who'd treated Elias testified about the injuries, the 7-stitch laceration, the bruising, the elevated blood pressure consistent with severe stress. FBI forensic analysts testified about the deleted security footage they'd recovered from Harbor Grill's system, showing 3 previous incidents where Trent Calloway had harassed minority customers. Agent Park took the stand on day 4, walking the jury through the Ridgehaven First Facebook group with clinical precision. Messages from Trent appeared on the courtroom screens, each one more damning than the last. Old black guy at the diner every morning like he owns the place. Martinez family won't take a hint. Time for more direct persuasion. Why are we tolerating these people in our spaces? Hassan let the words hang in the air before asking, Agent Park, based on your investigation, was the assault on Mr. Brooks an isolated incident or part of a pattern? Part of a pattern. Mr. Calloway was involved in at least 15 documented instances of harassment or intimidation targeting minorities over a 5-year period. The assault on Mr. Brooks was the first time he became physically violent, but the bias-motivated behavior was long-standing and well-documented. Webb's cross-examination tried to separate the Facebook messages from the assault itself, arguing that words weren't actions and that the prosecution was trying to put an entire town on trial instead of one man for one incident. Park didn't let him. Mr. Calloway's words establish his state of mind. They prove his animus toward minorities was not momentary anger, but deeply held belief. That transformed simple assault into a hate crime under federal law. On day 6, the prosecution called Elias Brooks. He walked to the witness stand with the same measured pace he used entering Harbor Grill each morning, right hand raised to swear the oath, voice steady as he promised to tell the truth. Hassan began gently, establishing background, his military service, his marriage, his decision to retire in Ridgehaven, his daily routine. Then she moved to the assault itself. "Mr. Brooks, can you describe what happened on the morning of March 14th? Elias did, his testimony matching the video and the other witnesses, but adding context they couldn't provide. The feeling of being surrounded by people who wouldn't help, the calculation of whether fighting back would make things worse, the moment when he realized his only option was to call someone who had power these people couldn't ignore. When Mr. Calloway demanded you apologize for breathing his air, what did you understand that to mean?" "I understood it to mean he objected to my existence in a space he considered his, not just the diner, but Ridgehaven itself. I was supposed to disappear to make him comfortable." "And when he struck you, what went through your mind?" Elias paused, the memory clearly still sharp. "I thought, here we go again, because it wasn't the first time someone decided I didn't belong somewhere. It was just the first time in Ridgehaven it got physical. And I thought about all the other times I'd walked away, stayed quiet, made myself small to avoid exactly this. And I was tired of it. 72 years old, and I was tired of apologizing for existing." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Webb's cross-examination was careful, almost respectful, recognizing that attacking an elderly veteran would alienate the jury. He focused on establishing that Elias couldn't definitively prove Trent's motivation was racial rather than personal. "Mr. Brooks, isn't it possible my client simply didn't like you as an individual and race had nothing to do with it?" Elias looked at him with eyes that had seen decades of this exact deflection. "Mr. Webb, in my experience, when white people don't like black people as individuals, race always has something to do with it. Maybe they don't burn crosses or use slurs, but the assumption that we don't belong, that our presence requires justification, that we're less deserving of basic respect, that's racial bias, whether they admit it or not. But you can't read my client's mind. I can read his Facebook messages. I can read the pattern of his behavior. I can read the fact that he's never harassed a white customer, but has harassed multiple minorities. I can read context, Mr. Webb, and the context is clear. The defense rested after 2 days, their case consisting mainly of character witnesses who testified that Trent was a good neighbor, a hard worker, someone who'd made a terrible mistake but wasn't a racist. The prosecution's rebuttal witnesses, people Trent had harassed over the years, systematically dismantled that narrative. Closing arguments came on a Friday afternoon, both sides summarizing 12 days of testimony and evidence into concentrated appeals to justice. Hassan spoke last, the prosecution's privilege. "The defense wants you to believe this was a simple assault, a momentary lapse, unconnected to race. But the evidence tells a different story. It tells the story of a man who spent years treating minorities as second-class citizens, who coordinated with others to make their lives difficult, who saw Elias Brooks sitting in a diner and decided that was a problem requiring a violent solution. Federal hate crime law exists precisely for cases like this. When someone is targeted for violence because of who they are, not what they've done. Trent Calloway assaulted Elias Brooks because Mr. Brooks is black, and because Mr. Calloway believed that made him less deserving of respect, of safety, of the simple right to eat breakfast in peace. That's not a simple assault, that's a hate crime, and your verdict should reflect that truth." The jury deliberated for 9 hours over 2 days. When they filed back into the courtroom on Tuesday morning, their faces revealed nothing. The foreperson, a middle-aged white woman who'd worked as a school principal, stood when asked if they'd reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor." "On the charge of willfully causing bodily injury because of race, how do you find?" "Guilty." The word dropped into the courtroom like a stone into still water, ripples spreading outward. Behind Elias, someone gasped. In the defendant's gallery, Patricia Calloway began crying. Trent himself went rigid, face draining of color. "On the charge of conspiracy to violate civil rights, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the charge of assault resulting in bodily injury?" "Guilty." 3 guilty verdicts, each one confirming what everyone who'd seen the evidence already knew. Trent Calloway had committed federal crimes, and he would face federal consequences. The judge thanked the jury, set sentencing for 6 weeks out, and remanded Trent to custody pending the hearing. U.S. Marshals approached to take him into custody. As they did, Trent turned one last time to look at Elias, and what passed between them was finality, the end of one story and the beginning of another. Outside the courthouse, Malcolm stood with his father as reporters shouted questions and camera flashes created artificial lightning. "How do you feel about the verdict, Mr. Brooks?" Elias considered the question, choosing his words carefully. "I feel like justice was served, not just for me, but for everyone in Ridgehaven who'd been harassed or intimidated or made to feel less than fully human. This verdict says that behavior has consequences. It says federal law means something. It says you can't assault people because of their race and expect to walk away." "Do you forgive Trent Calloway?" The question clearly surprised him. Forgiveness is complicated. What he did was wrong. The verdict was right. Whether I forgive him personally, that's between me and my conscience, and it doesn't change what happened or what he deserves legally. Justice and forgiveness are separate things. He's getting justice. Whether he eventually gets forgiveness depends on whether he does the work to deserve it. What message does this send to other small towns? Malcolm answered this one. It sends the message that civil rights are not negotiable, that the federal government will protect those rights when local institutions fail to, that coordination to exclude or harass minorities is conspiracy, and conspiracy is a crime, and that change is coming whether communities embrace it willingly or have it imposed on them. Sentencing arrived in late November, the courthouse decorated for approaching holidays, while inside the machinery of justice determined how much of Trent Calloway's life would be forfeit to his choices. Hassan requested the maximum, 10 years in federal prison, followed by supervised release, plus restitution and mandatory participation in rehabilitation programs. Webb argued for mercy. His client had no prior record, had expressed remorse, had already lost his business and his reputation. The judge, a black woman named Margaret Osei, who'd spent 30 years on the bench and had no patience for excuses, split the difference but leaned toward severity. "Mr. Calloway, what you did was not a momentary mistake. It was the physical manifestation of beliefs you'd held and acted on for years. You assaulted an elderly veteran in public because you believed his race made him less deserving of basic dignity. That belief and the actions flowing from it represent everything federal hate crime legislation was designed to combat." She paused, letting the weight settle. "I sentence you to 7 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You will pay restitution to Mr. Brooks in the amount of $15,000 to cover medical expenses, legal fees, and pain and suffering. You will participate in cognitive behavioral therapy focusing on racial bias. And upon release, you will perform 500 hours of community service in programs serving minority communities." Trent's head dropped. His mother's sobs filled the courtroom, but the sentence was just, and everyone knew it. As marshals led Trent away, Elias felt something release in his chest. Not joy exactly, but the exhaustion that comes when you can finally stop fighting because the battle is over. While the trial had unfolded, Ridgehaven itself underwent transformation that was slower but no less profound. The consent decree imposed by the Department of Justice mandated sweeping changes: complete restructuring of the police department under federal oversight, fair housing enforcement with independent monitoring, anti-discrimination training for all municipal employees, and establishment of a civilian review board with real authority. Chief Morrison, having cooperated extensively with investigators, avoided prosecution but lost his job. Half his department resigned, rather than work under federal oversight. The officers who remained underwent months of retraining, their every action scrutinized by DOJ monitors who had neither patience nor sympathy for backsliding. Tom Bannister and the other indicted officials faced their own trials, most pleading guilty to reduced charges in exchange for cooperation and resignation from public office. The Ridgehaven First Facebook group was dismantled, its messages serving as evidence in multiple prosecutions. But beyond legal consequences, something subtler was happening. The glare of national attention had forced Ridgehaven to see itself as others saw it, not a charming mountain town, but a place that had systematically excluded and degraded people based on race. Some residents doubled down, insisting they were victims of outside interference and political correctness. Others, confronted with evidence of harms they'd ignored or enabled, began the uncomfortable work of genuine self-examination. Harbor Grill became an unlikely symbol of that transformation. Sam Pritchard, to his credit, didn't just make changes to avoid federal charges. He made them because the alternative was continuing to be complicit in injustice he could no longer unsee. He hired a diversity consultant from Richmond who helped him implement new policies, train staff, and create an explicitly welcoming environment. He reached out personally to every person who'd filed complaints about being mistreated, offering apologies that were sometimes accepted and sometimes rejected, but were always genuine. Most significantly, he removed the crime scene tape from Elias's corner booth and installed a small plaque that read, "Reserved for Mr. Elias Brooks, Purple Heart recipient, and reminder that dignity is not negotiable." When Elias saw it for the first time, the morning after sentencing, he stood silently for a long moment. Then he asked Sam to remove it. "I appreciate the gesture, but I don't want a plaque. I just want to be a customer like anyone else. That's all I ever wanted." Sam removed it immediately, understanding that the best tribute wasn't commemoration, but simply treating Elias like he deserved to be treated all along. The diner's clientele changed too. The morning regulars still came, but they were joined by new faces. Black families from Smithton who'd heard Harbor Grill was under new management, Latino workers who'd previously avoided Main Street, students from the community college filming projects about small-town transformation. The mix was imperfect, sometimes awkward, but genuine. One morning in December, nearly 9 months after the assault, Elias arrived at his usual time to find Dorothy Mills sitting in the booth adjacent to his usual spot. She stood when she saw him, nervous but determined. "Mr. Brooks, I wanted to tell you I've been volunteering with the NAACP chapter in Smithton, helping them document housing discrimination cases. It's not much, but it's something." Elias considered her, this woman who'd watched him bleed and done nothing, who'd spent months since trying to become someone different. "How's it going?" he asked. "Hard. I'm learning how much I didn't see, or chose not to see. How many systems I benefited from without questioning." She managed a small, sad smile. "I'm 70 now. Feels late to be getting educated about basic humanity, but better late than never, I suppose." "Better late than never," Elias agreed. He gestured to the booth. "Care to join me for coffee?" The invitation surprised her, hope and uncertainty warring in her expression. "Are you sure?" "No, but we have to start somewhere." They sat together in silence for a moment before Dorothy spoke again. "Can I ask you something? Why stay in Ridgehaven? After everything that happened, why not leave?" Elias stirred his coffee, considering the question he'd been asked dozens of times. Because leaving would have meant they won, not Trent specifically, the whole system that believed people like me should disappear rather than make people like him uncomfortable. If I left, Ridgehaven would have stayed exactly as it was. But if I stayed, if I kept showing up and demanding to be treated like a human being with full rights to exist here, then maybe things had to change. And have they changed? Some. Not enough. Not permanently yet. That'll take years, maybe generations. But yes, some. You're sitting here having this conversation. The police department's being rebuilt. People are asking harder questions about who belongs and who decides. That's change. Lena appeared with the coffee pot, refilled both cups, smiled at the sight of them sitting together. Small moment. Insignificant to anyone who didn't know the history. But to those who did, it was evidence that transformation was possible, however incomplete. 6 months later, Malcolm stood in Ridgehaven's community center before a packed audience, presenting the findings from the DOJ's first annual review of the consent decree implementation. "Ridgehaven has made measurable progress," he announced, reading from a detailed report. "Police complaints from minority residents are being investigated at rates comparable to complaints from white residents. Fair housing violations have dropped by 70%. Public accommodations are demonstrably more accessible to all community members. These are real improvements that reflect genuine effort." He paused, looked up from the paper. "However, progress is not perfection. We've documented instances of resistance, subtle discrimination that's harder to prosecute but no less real, an ongoing tension between those embracing change and those resenting it. The consent decree remains in effect, and federal monitoring will continue until we're confident that improvements are sustainable without external oversight." From the audience, Jerome Walker raised his hand. What happens if Ridgehaven backslides? If local leadership changes and they try to return to the old ways? Then federal oversight returns in full force, Malcolm said flatly. The consent decree includes triggers, specific benchmarks that, if violated, automatically reinstate comprehensive DOJ supervision. Ridgehaven's leaders have a choice: maintain progress voluntarily or have it enforced involuntarily. Either way, the minimum standard is equal treatment under law. That's not negotiable. After the meeting, Malcolm joined his father at the small house on Oakwood Drive, sitting in the living room where Margaret's photo still held place of honor on the mantel. "You think it'll stick?" Elias asked. "The changes?" "Some of it, the legal requirements, the procedural reforms, those will stick as long as oversight continues. The cultural shift, that's harder. Some people will genuinely change. Some will just get better at hiding their bias. Some will wait for federal attention to move elsewhere, then try to slide back." Sounds pessimistic. Sounds realistic. Malcolm sat forward, elbows on knees. "But here's what I know, Dad. You changed Ridgehaven. Maybe not completely, maybe not permanently, but undeniably. There are kids growing up here now who will remember that when minorities were treated unjustly, the federal government intervened, that civil rights are real and enforceable, that one person standing their ground can trigger transformation. That matters." Elias smiled, tired but genuine. "Your mother would say I'm taking too much credit. She'd say it was community effort, all the people who spoke up and testified and refused to stay silent. She'd be right. But it started with you refusing to leave, refusing to accept that assault was just how things were, making one phone call that changed everything." They sat in comfortable silence, father and son, both understanding that justice was never a destination but always a journey, that victories were temporary unless constantly defended, that the work never truly ended. Outside, Ridgehaven continued its transformation, slow, uneven, resisted by some and embraced by others, but undeniably different than it had been. Harbor Grill served breakfast to a genuinely diverse crowd now. The police department, rebuilt from the ground up, was actually investigating complaints regardless of the complainant's race. Housing discrimination cases were being prosecuted. The Ridgehaven First mentality was being replaced, gradually, with something that at least resembled genuine community. Perfect? No. Better? Yes. Enough? That remained to be seen. On a Tuesday morning in late spring, nearly 18 months after the assault, Elias Brooks walked into Harbor Grill at 7 a.m. sharp. He took his usual booth, ordered his usual breakfast from Lena, and opened his paperback Western to the marked page. The diner was comfortably full, contractors and retirees, yes, but also a young black couple with a toddler, a group of Latino construction workers, a Muslim woman in a hijab reading a laptop, students from the community college's new satellite campus. No one stared. No one questioned anyone's right to be there. People ate, talked, existed together in the kind of mundane normalcy that should have been unremarkable, but in Ridgehaven represented hard-won progress. Sam brought Elias's coffee personally, set it down with a nod that had become their morning ritual. "Good to see you, Mr. Brooks." "Good to be seen, Sam." Simple exchange. Nothing profound in the words themselves, but in the comfort of it, the absence of tension, the basic human recognition. That was everything. Elias sipped his coffee, savored the bitter heat, and thought about Margaret, about Korea, about 72 years of existing in a country that sometimes welcomed him and sometimes didn't, but that he'd served and lived in and refused to abandon despite everything. He thought about Trent Calloway, 5 years into a 7-year sentence, reportedly participating in rehabilitation programs and writing letters of apology that Elias had read but not responded to. Redemption was possible, but it wasn't Elias's job to grant it. That was between Trent and whatever remained of his conscience. He thought about Ridgehaven, this town that had wounded him and been wounded in turn, now struggling towards something better, even if better remained frustratingly incomplete. And he thought about tomorrow, when he'd wake up and do this again. Because the work of existing with dignity in spaces that had tried to exclude you wasn't work that ended. It was work you did every day, one breakfast at a time, until maybe, someday, it wouldn't be work anymore. It would just be living, His eggs arrived, perfectly cooked. His toast was golden. The sun broke through morning clouds, casting warm light through Harbor Grill's windows. Elias Brooks, Purple Heart recipient, widower, father, survivor of wars both foreign and domestic, picked up his fork and began to eat. Not because it was remarkable, but because it was ordinary. And ordinary. The simple right to exist without justification, without performance, without apology, was what he'd been fighting for all along. Respect, as he'd told Noah's documentary camera all those months ago, wasn't a favor. It was the minimum. And Ridgehaven, at last, was learning to deliver it.